On to ethnomethodology today. So this is the last of our theoretical paradigms that are attempting to answer the question: why does a subjective reality, that is to say, social reality, strike us as a facticity, right? All right, so Harold Garfinkel. He's kind of a big deal. And he was here. He spent his career here at UCLA. So the vast majority of his career was spent at UCLA. He coined the term ethnomethodology. What does ethnomethodology refer to? Ethnomethodology refers to the sociological study of the methods or the procedures that people use in everyday life for sustaining, again, read this as facticity, right? The natural facts of everyday life. Right? So it refers to the sociological study of the methods or the procedures that people use in everyday life for sustaining the facticity of social reality. Which again, I think Berger and Luckman put it perfectly when they say, what is the intrigue all about? What is the interest sociologists have in social reality all about? Because, as we defined last week, objective means not dependent on the mind. It means it exists independently of minds. But yet social realities are constituted by subjectivity, or what Schutz called intersubjectivity, right? But yet, nevertheless, social realities strike us. We encounter them, particularly at a young age, as facticities, as things that are not of human origin, of human making. How does that come to be? That something that is made by human beings does not feel, we do not encounter it, we do not experience it as if it is something that human beings created. In office hours last week, I was using an example of, because this is one of the social facts that Durkheim said we should study as sociologists, morality. Right? Morality is a type of social fact. Social facts are things. What does that mean? It means that once you've internalized morality and you do something that transgresses a moral precept, you feel guilt, like the way maybe you feel a baseball bat when it's struck against you. It's real, just in a way that a bat is real or a ball is real, and when a bat or a ball strikes you, it hurts. Well, you break moral precepts, and it hurts because you feel the guilt, and you try to tell yourself, but it's all made up. But yet it doesn't go away. Morality is a social fact. It's a thing. And we feel the guilt when we break the precepts. And somebody might say, oh, well, all morality is made up. Yeah, but you still feel guilty. Durkheim's aphorism, social facts are things. The concreteness of social facts is sociology's most fundamental phenomenon. How did something thoroughly subjective become objective? Do we experience it as something that is not of human origin? Even though we can, as anthropologists and cultural anthropologists do, they go around and talk about the moral relativity of our codes. But those individuals and those societies do not experience their moral codes as relative. People live and die by their morality. Garfinkel attributes the concreteness of social reality to, again, reality constituting procedures that are carried out during social interaction. So he wants to look at the procedures or the methods, ethnomethodology, the methods that people use in sustaining the facticity of social reality. So it's different, right? It's different than, say, Schutz. We've already established what is Schutz's contribution. He says, well, what is it that sustains any social reality? It's intersubjectivity. And he identifies the three cognitive resources that people draw upon in order to sustain intersubjectivity. and its stocks of knowledge and its recipes and its typifications. Okay, and then we moved on to Berger and Luckman. They said, well, we're not looking at cognitive resources. We're looking at the processes of reality construction. We say it begins with externalization. That leads to objectification. The next generation internalizes that as real, and over millennia, you have the reification of social reality. And then what Garfinkel does is he says, I want to focus on the sense-making practices and procedures that individuals employ in everyday life to convince one another that social reality is real. So here we have the breakdown of ethnomethodology. We have ethno, that means people. Method refers to systematic procedure. Enology is the study of. So we're studying people's systematic procedures, the procedures that they use to maintain facticity, the facticity of social reality. So ethnomethodologists, they seek to explain how people make joint sense of their social world together, and how they do so methodically using social procedures or methods that they share. Right? So the focus is on the behaviors, the focus is on the practices, the methods that people use. What are some of the methods that people use for sense-making and for sustaining social reality? Right? It is different than, say, purely cognitive resources. Garfinkel's position is that a theory of action must address how people make sense of their realities. How people make sense of their realities. A theory of action. Social order, that is to say the organization of collective activity, it requires sense-making procedures. So that's what he's investigating. It's like the theory of action must address how people make sense of the real. How do they do it? So his objective becomes one of, I'm going to identify, and for our purposes today in lecture, we're going to identify three particular practices or procedures that individuals draw on every day in order to make sense of their realities. And in turn, by making sense of their realities, they are treating those realities as real. So one of the most central features in the organization of social activity is intelligibility. How do we make ourselves intelligible to one another? How do we help people make sense of what's going on here? So the idea is that if we're ever going to arrive at a phenomenon of social order, that requires sense-making procedures that individuals themselves adopt to then arrive at this orchestrated social reality. Right? So it's presuppositional, in other words. There are presuppositions for the social order. What is it that makes social organization possible? Garfinkel says, well, it's sense-making practices, it's sense-making procedures. Individuals have to be able jointly to make sense of what's going on if they're ever going to arrive at a condition of social order and social organization. So he says, let's uncover that. Let's focus our attention, our analysis on these sense-making procedures that are necessary for then producing social order in the first place. As John Heritage, also professor emeritus here at UCLA, and who wrote this book, which I'm going to read excerpts from, Garfinkel and Ethnomethodology. In fact, it's unfortunate we had to cut Anthony Giddens out of week 10, but I just felt with the holiday we really didn't have time to cover it. But Anthony Giddens, who there's part of a chapter on the work of Anthony Giddens. It was Anthony Giddens that asked John Heritage to write a book on Garfinkel and ethnomethodology. Right? So he says, okay. And Anthony Giddens spent a little time at UCLA here as well, to expose himself and familiarize himself with ethnomethodology. So these are the words of John Heritage then. The question is, how do social actors come to know and know in common what they are doing and the circumstances in which they are doing it? That is Garfinkel's question. And again, the heart of this question is intelligibility. It's sense-making. Social order is contingent on sense-making practices. So let's identify them. Let's identify the sense-making practices that people use, just in the way that, say, Alfred Schutz identified the cognitive resources that people draw on to maintain their subjectivity, right? According to Garfinkel, here it is, intelligibility is achieved through the use of various sense-making procedures. Today I want to talk about three. I'm going to have to move fast to get through all three of them. But here are the three. The first one is referred to the documentary method of interpretation. Very much in line with symbolic interactionism. People do not simply react to environmental stimuli. We respond, and we respond based on an interpretation of what's going on. What symbolic interactionists refer to as a definition of the situation. But still, what documentary method of interpretation and definition of situation have in common is you have people that are interpreting things. The interpretation will decide what is the appropriate response from the person, right? So there's once again an emphasis on a unique attribute of human behavior, of our cognitive abilities, which is we have to interpret in order to know how to respond. I also want to talk about indexical expressions, or indexicality. Indexicality, as it was termed in the reading. So we want to get to indexicality. What does that refer to? And then lastly, descriptive accountings. Accounting. So these are the three that we'll talk about today: the documentary method of interpretation, indexical expressions, and descriptive accountings. These are, in other words, three sense-making procedures that Garfinkel identified to help us that we use to make our actions intelligible to one another, and which ultimately then sustain social reality. The documentary method of interpretation stresses the selective nature of human perception. As I said before, in my social psychology class, we spent an entire week discussing this, making this point, that consciousness is not passive, consciousness is active. We're active perceivers. We're identifying, say, evidences of a more broader pattern. Right? It's the term that psychologists use is schema. We have schema that help us identify what are the essential properties of something. Husserl writes, consciousness constitutes perception. The role of consciousness, that is to say awareness or attention, is not passive, but active in the constitution of the objects of experiences. Not passive, but active. So he provides us with a series of examples that show the way in which consciousness is active and not passive. This method consists of treating an actual appearance as the document of, as pointing to, a presupposed underlying pattern. That this is one way in which cognition works. We identify the underlying pattern, and it's based on that underlying pattern that we're then able to identify specifics that can then be used to illuminate, once again, the underlying pattern. Individual evidences are interpreted on the basis of what is known about the underlying pattern. That is to say that specifics are interpreted in light of a generality, starting with a generality and interpreting specifics in light of that generality. So the generality, what is it that I see in front of me? How is it that I define or interpret that? Will then help me make sense of the specifics within. So, for example, simple enough, here we have a duck. We have the image of a duck. And because I know that this is a duck, then I can look to the protuberances on the left side of this duck and say, well, then what are those protuberances? Those protuberances refer to a beak. Right? I look at this image. This image is a duck. I see that there are protuberances on the left, and so I say that that is a duck beak, or that is a duck bill. Right? And then if asked the question, well, what is that dot there in roughly the center of the figure? Then you would say, well, the dot is an eye. Right? It's an eyeball. Right? So we're able to identify the specifics, the protuberances on the left and the dot, right, as an eyeball, once we've established that this figure is a duck. So interpreting specifics in light of a generality. As John Heritage writes, what is known about the underlying pattern is that figure 2 represents a duck. So that's our general understanding of what this image is. Thus, as I was saying, the protuberances on the left of the figure are interpreted as a beak. So we're moving then from the general to the specific. I see that that's a duck. I'm able to identify the dot as an eye. I'm able to identify the protuberances as a bill or beak. All right, the task is one of intelligibility, making sense of what something is. And the small indentation, we can't forget about that indentation on the right side. And the small indentation on the right of the figure is treated as what? Irrelevant. There was a sloppy cartoonist. Right? Drew the bill and then was coming around on the back of the duck head and maybe bumped into something, and so that's how you get that little indentation on the right. Okay. But what if we say, this figure is not a figure of a duck, but it's actually a figure of a rabbit? What suddenly happens to the specifics? The specifics are transformed into something different than they were when we started with the underlying pattern of this being a duck. Suddenly, the exact same image. I did not change the image. The image was not altered. But I'm defining the image now as a rabbit, and defining the image as a rabbit, now the specifics are entirely different. That what was once the beak or the bill of the duck becomes the ears of the rabbit. And the eye remains the eyeball, but that little indentation on the right side now suddenly becomes the mouth of the rabbit. Interpreting specifics in light of a generality. It's an important sense-making capability. Note, Heritage writes, however, that once the figure is viewed as a rabbit, not only does the feature previously identified as a beak become the ears, but also the small indentation on the right of the figure becomes, keyword, relevant. Becomes relevant as the rabbit's mouth. Historically, we do this all the time. Things are treated as irrelevant, and then suddenly they are seen as relevant. What about this image? What is this an image of? Is this an image of a vase? Or is this an image of two faces? It comes down to active perception. To perceive it, well, we can perceive it as both, but of course, I could present it to you as one or the other, and chances are you would continue to perceive it as one or the other until I said it's two things. A vase or a pair of faces. And this is what really captures the ethnomethodologist's interest and attention, is the following. And again, I mean, John Heritage is such a fabulous, fantastic writer. What differs between these alternative scenes is not the sensory information presented by the figure. This remains constant. The figure that I showed you, that first we defined as a duck and then later as a rabbit, nothing about that figure changed. But you came to perceive the specifics quite differently. That's active consciousness. It's not passive, it's active. And our perception constitutes reality itself. It's the same with the image of the vase or the pair of faces. The image does not change. It is the same thing. So it's how that thing is interpreted. Rather, the difference lies in the way in which the figure is attended to, how it's attended to, the attention given to it. This is another great example. I'll just read from, I've got some excerpts to read from here. A widow age, and there are certain key words here in the sentence, right, that prime us to interpret the specifics in light of an underlying pattern. This is why you always have, I love, I'm such a nerd, I just love this. I love going around, post-election, going around and looking at these different headlines and how Trump's re-election is interpreted in light of an underlying pattern. And the Wall Street Journal says that Trump was elected the 47th president, and the New York Times says that Trump seizes power. A widow aged 83 was found gassed, that is to say dead, in the kitchen of her cottage. Your perception is about to be primed, where she had lived alone since the death of her husband. They found also that rugs and towels had been stuffed under the doors. How are we to interpret her death? Atkinson has described the following circumstances which were brought before a British coroner's court. The case involves circumstances in which a widow aged 83 was found gassed in the kitchen of her cottage where she had lived alone since the death of her husband. Rugs and towels had been stuffed under the doors and around the window casements. At this stage, the reader is likely to have derived a possible underlying pattern from the individual documentary evidences. This pattern will very probably involve the conclusion that the old lady committed suicide. As this pattern emerges, so it firms up the initial impression of the evidence. Loneliness and loss become the underlying psychological dynamic attributed to the act. And rehearsing the widow's last acts, we imagine her putting the rugs and towels in position, switching on the gas taps, and sitting in her chair, waiting for the end to come. At this stage, we have achieved a fit between the various circumstances and the act. Particulars and pattern have elaborated one another to the point of certainty. Lived alone since the death, it must have been a lonely existence. We can start to see why somebody under these conditions would commit suicide. Yet, just as we saw earlier, that one interpretation occluded another alternative interpretation, so a similar process may be going on here. At the inquest, the 4 people who knew her testified that she had always seemed to be a very happy and cheerful person. This evidence introduces a disturbance into our picture. Perhaps the old lady was not so much lonely and depressed as deaf and absent-minded. With this consideration, both the documentary evidences and the underlying patterns seem to shift. It is winter, after all. The rugs and towels were designed to keep the heat in and the drafts out. Our rehearsal of the widow's last hours now depicts her as turning on the gas stove for some purpose and forgetting to light it, or perhaps the gas flame blowing out in the draft. We envision the old lady sitting down unaware of the gas hissing into the atmosphere and nodding off into the gas-filled room. Every individual documentary appearance is accounted for, but they now come to form a quite different underlying pattern. And now this is for the fun of watching Dateline. If anyone likes to watch Dateline or any of these crime shows, and they're very strategic about what type of information they tell you because they're trying to lead you in one direction. And you go, oh, certainly that person did it. And they say, oh, but at the end they had an alibi. They were at the bar. And so you have to scrap that theory. And all those things you took as being clearly the interview that person was when interviewed by the detectives. He said, oh, that's clearly this person committed the crime. Look at how nervous they are. Look at how weird they're behaving. There's no consistency to things that they're saying. Seizing on those particulars as evidence of an underlying pattern. But then finding out later, actually, that person was at the pub. They were at the bar at the time of the murder, so they couldn't have done it. In his studies of the documentary method at work, Garfinkel developed a demonstration which was designed to exaggerate the process. Designed to exaggerate this process. And one of the many, they're often referred to as experiments, but really they're demonstrations. So the student counseling experiment. Unknown to the subject, the counselor predetermined his sequence of yes or no answers. But the student participating in the counseling experiment or demonstration assumes, this is the underlying pattern, that every time a yes or no is given by a counselor, it's given directly in response to a question that the student has answered, not that it was given arbitrarily. So the student then is engaging in accommodative work. Here we go. I'll read you a section of this. Bear with me here. Okay? The demonstration consisted of a student counseling experiment in which undergraduates were invited to participate in research exploring alternative means to psychotherapy as a way of giving persons advice about their personal problems. In each case, the subject was asked to describe the background of his problem and to ask the counselor at least 10 questions about it. Each question was to be designed so as to permit a yes or no answer. The subject and the experimenter counselor were situated in adjoining rooms and connected by intercom. The subject was required to tape record his reflections on each answer after disconnecting the intercom so that the counselor would not hear your remarks. Unknown to the subject, the naive subject, the critical subject. The experimenter, counselor, predetermined his sequence of yes or no answers with a table of random numbers. At the completion of the questions and answers, the subject was asked to summarize his impressions of the exchange as a whole. Part of one of these exchanges is reproduced below. So, you can bear with me, it's about 2 pages. Case 1, subject. Okay, this is a personal problem that these undergraduate students have a question. or asking the experimenter. Okay, this is the situation that I am presented with. I happen to be of the Jewish faith, and I have been dating a Gentile girl now for about 2 months. My dad is not directly opposed to the situation, but I feel at the same time that he is not exactly pleased with it. Mother feels that as long as Dad is not directly opposed to this situation, then I should go ahead and continue dating until he makes some direct statement to the contrary. My reason for feeling why he is not too pleased with this is that he has never said don't date her, but at the same time he will come up with digs and sayings that make me feel very ill at ease about dating the girl. My question is, do you feel, under the present circumstances, that I should continue or stop dating this girl? Let me put that in a positive way. Do you feel that I should continue dating this girl? Experimenter, my answer is no. Subject, no. Well, that is kind of interesting. I kind of feel that there is really no great animosity between Dad and I, but well, perhaps he feels that greater dislike will grow out of this. I suppose, or maybe it is easier for an outsider to see certain things that I am blind to at this moment. I would like to ask my second question now. Experimenter says, okay. Subject, do you feel that I should have a further discussion with Dad about the situation or not? Should I have further discussion with Dad over this subject about dating the Gentile girl? The experimenter says, my answer is yes. Subject, well, I feel that is reasonable, but I really don't know what to say to him. I mean, he seems to be not really too understanding. In other words, he seems to be afraid really to discuss the situation. I mean, at least it appears that way to me so far, but I guess if it is worthwhile to me, if I really want to continue to date her, I will go on and have this discussion with Dad. I really don't know what to say because I am dating her. I am not in love with her or anything, but I really never know what is going to come out. I guess we should have a discussion based on what the future possibilities might be and how he would feel about that. He may not be too strongly opposed now because we are only dating. But perhaps he sees future complications that he would really like to get off his chest at the moment. I am ready for my third question now. If, after having my conversation with Dad, and he says to continue dating her, but at the same time he gives me the impression that he is really not, he really does not want me to date her, but he is only doing it because he wants to be a good dad. Under these conditions, should I still date the girl? Experimenter, my answer is yes. Did I lose you? Subject, okay, seems contradictory. Well, I am actually surprised at the answer. I expected a no answer on that. Perhaps this is because you are not quite aware of my dad and his reactions, and he seems to be the type of person that is sensitive, and therefore he is very careful in the way that he will handle things. What is it that the student is doing, right? Because what is happening here is these responses that are provided by the experimenter were at random. Of course, the student does not know that those answers were provided at random. So what the student involved in this experiment then is trying to do is to interpret those responses, that is to say the specifics, in light of the underlying pattern. That this person has been entrusted with providing advice. Participants went to considerable lengths to sustain the interchange as a course of advice, because that's what they were told they would be given. But this experimenter is saying things that are contradictory. It becomes the work of the listener, the work of the student, to make consistent what that person's response is, that person's yes or no answers. despite several appearances to the contrary. So the underlying pattern was assumed from the outset to be the basis on which the appearances should be interpreted. None of the subjects had difficulty in accomplishing the series of 10 questions and then summarizing and evaluating the advice. So it's the listener, it's the hearer that's doing the work of interpreting yes and no answers as being consistent because they believe that ultimately the person that's answering is doing so intentionally, purposefully, not at random. And they're interpreting that in light of the underlying pattern. When handling incomplete, inappropriate, and contradictory answers, these answers were found to be this way for a reason. Isn't that fascinating? We're providing contradictory information, but we're able to interpret that information not as contradictory. Oh, okay, I see why you might be saying that. That seems to contradict what you just said, but I see why you might be saying that. Because after all, you're supposed to be giving advice. This is what Garfinkel referred to as the maintenance of organized activity. Social organization is viewed as a product of coordinated, accommodative work. And you just watch Fox News and watch MSNBC and watch them do the accommodative work. And watch them interpret the exact same thing entirely differently, and everybody plays along with the interpretation of the specifics in light of the general underlying pattern. Whatever that general underlying pattern might be for MSNBC or Fox News. At every possible point, the participants seem to be willing to give the underlying pattern the benefit of the doubt, to interpret the specifics in light of the underlying pattern. To say, okay, well that seems a little odd, a little contradictory, but you're supposed to be giving me advice, so I'll find a way to interpret what you're saying as advice. Okay, on to indexicality or indexical expressions again. First one is the sense-making work that we perform, the documentary method of interpretation, starting with with an underlying pattern and extrapolating, identifying specifics based on that pattern. There's another sense-making strategy that Garfinkel discussed in detail, and that is referred to as indexicality or indexical expressions. Like the documentary method of interpretation, indexicality is a sense-making procedures. Just as when we get to descriptive accountings, that too is a sense-making procedure. It is based on the recognition, indexicality, that the sense of ordinary descriptive terms is powerfully uttered by the context in which they are uttered. So part of the interpretation is taking into account the context. That we're reading, we're interpreting, we're making sense of utterances within the context that they're uttered. That it's the context that fills things in. Why is this? Well, that's because words are both approximate and they're indeterminate. Bird, for example, Garfinkel points out, can refer to any number of birds. Right? You say, well, what was that? What did I just see? Well, you saw a bird. But one could ask, well, what type of bird? Right? Of course, we can call on other words to identify the type of bird that it is, but it's just a typification. Just bird. In blue, another example, can refer to any number of shades of blue. Well, what sort of blue are we talking about? Are we talking about navy blue, or are we talking about royal blue, or light blue? Words are both approximate and determinate. That it's able to, if we just say blue, we're able to distinguish the color of something. That is to say that it's not red, or it's not purple, or it's not brown. It's blue. But what type of blue is it? People draw on context to determine the specific meaning of descriptive utterances. The first time I ever heard the word, maybe I used this example before, but the word, or the phrase, "it slaps." And I had just shared some music with, this is pre-COVID. The student would always come to office hours and we'd always talk about music over. So then I was like, oh, you should listen to this. And the next time I saw him, he's riding a skateboard. He's like, Professor Sigmund, that album slaps. I was like, I don't know what this means. Slaps? Is that bad? Is that good? Plenty of cases in which slapping is bad. But he was so joyful when he said, oh, this album slaps. And I was like, that must be good. Slapping, it slaps, must be an indication that something is good. But it was not, the meaning of "it slaps" was not conveyed exclusively by the words themselves. That I had to take things into context. His gesturing, his mood, what it was in response to, because I, after all, recommended the album and I really liked it. Thus, people draw upon context to determine the specific meaning of descriptive utterances. So while blue, in fact, as we were just saying, while blue may refer to an indeterminate array of shades, this is not a problem when asked to catch the next blue bus. The blueness of the blue is not the issue. It is by virtue of our contextualizing activities as hearers that as speakers we can make good sense. Accommodative work. And Garfinkel, such an astute perceptive observer, identifying all the ways in which we as hearers engage in accommodative work so that the speakers can make sense. And we're getting to examples in which people stop engaging in accommodative work and start being difficult. And that's the Breachian experiment, where it's, I'm going to be very, very difficult. What bus am I looking for? Blue bus? What do you mean? What type of blue? What color blue? Royal blue? Dark blue? What sort of blue? It's just blue, okay? Here's an example that was provided in the text. Staring out at pouring rain, a speaker observes, what a wonderful summer we're having. How is that remark understood? How is it comprehended? How is it treated? How is it made sense of? The hearer concludes the remark is ironical. Most people would not say that a wonderful summer day involves pouring rain. Most people look forward to the summer precisely because it's not raining. That the sun's out and there's a blue sky and it's not gray and rainy. So it's the here. You can say, and comedians rely on this all the time. Say some. If it's taken too literally, of course, then you're not going to find the absurdity in it, right? But it's the hearers that are able to find the absurdity in the comment. They can conclude that the remark is ironical. Individuals must actively perform contextualizing work in order to see what the descriptions used in encounters mean. Indexicality, then, is a type of cooperative sense-making method. And this is one of those things that it's made visible. we've been socialized, we've been taught to engage in this accommodative work, but no one up until Garfinkel actually identified these before as forms of accommodative work. It's Garfinkel that's saying, you know what that is? That's accommodative work. You'll say, well, I knew I was supposed to hear that as ironical, but this is an important sense-making procedure. So in this case, we see that hearers must perform active contextualizing work in order to see what descriptions mean, and speakers must rely upon hearers performing such work, such accommodative work, in order that utterances will make definite sense. Look at all the accommodative work that goes into intelligibility. Individuals making themselves intelligible to one another. The hearer is assisting the speaker. They assume that the speaker has a point to make, and they're trying to understand that utterance as such. Just like with really combative intellectual debates, the two parties, or three or four, refuse to engage in accommodative work. They refuse to see the point in which the point that the other person's making. They refuse to see it. They're being difficult. They're being purposely difficult. We assume in everyday life that people will engage in such forms of accommodative work. So this gives us some insight into why Garfinkel treated the social order as a moral order, because we trust one another. I cannot make any sense independent of you trying to make sense of what I'm saying. You see this with couples all the time, and they're not getting along, and they just absolutely refuse to work with one another. They absolutely refuse to engage in accommodative work. I'm going to be as difficult as possible, so it's very difficult for you to make your point. But when relationships are going well, they're so accommodative, they're so cooperative. They want to see they want to understand the other person. They want to connect with the other person. They want to relate to the other person. But then something happens. They go, no. They start to distance themselves. They start to not engage in accommodative work so frequently. They go, I don't know. What were you trying to say? People trust that others will try to make sense of their descriptions according to the proposed documentary patterns and with proper contextualizing. Sort of giving the speaker the benefit of the doubt. Trust implies that intelligibility, that is to say sense-making, is a deeply moral matter. Depend on you. I depend on you to help me make this lecture intelligible. Work with me. Work with me. You could be a very difficult class, and raise your hand after every question. Say, can you explain that for me? 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 And I get furious. Well, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to explain it to you. Can you explain that to me? But you're a good class, and you go along with the lecture. I trust that you do that. Or if it happened over and over again in the class that there were so many clarifications required, well, then the lecture itself would be designed entirely differently. But I trust that you won't do that. Here we get to breaching experiments. Breaching experiments. This is where undergraduate students that participated in these breaching experiments, and again, they're not laboratory experiments, they're really demonstrations, right? But Garfinkel instructed his undergraduates to make trouble. The whole point was to be the difficult sibling, or, the difficult son, or whatever it might be, or the difficult student, right? Breaching experiments refer to demonstrations intentionally designed, to disrupt normal procedures, to expose the methods used by people to do what? To restore a sense of order. So Garfinkel says, let's do something that breaks down intelligibility. Let's do something that breaks down a sense of order. Let's throw out any accommodative work. And then see, how do people respond to that? And what does that tell us about people? They tell us something about how social structures are ordinarily and routinely maintained. Okay, so this is probably his best known example of a breaching experiment. This was in your reading. Procedurally, it is my preference to start with familiar scenes and ask, what can be done to make trouble? Let's disrupt. Let's intentionally disrupt the social order. So this is the case of the border or the stranger experiment. Right? Students are instructed to interact with their family members as if they were boarders. Let's say as if they say we're renting a room and not intimates. So they were to present themselves as well-behaved strangers. To who? To their family members. In another procedure, students were asked to spend from 15 minutes to an hour in their homes imagining that they were boarders and acting out this assumption. They were instructed to conduct themselves in a circumspect and polite fashion. So they were saying, now don't be rude, right? You're going to be the polite stranger. You're going to be very, very polite, painfully polite. Let's just see how your family responds to your politeness. They were to avoid getting personal, to use formal address only, and to speak only when spoken to. What were the... it's just wild, right? I mean, they're being told, now when you go home, I want you to be very polite to the members of your family. You're going to act like a stranger, but you're going to act very polite. The experiment revealed common sequential reactions. This wasn't, say, it happened once out of 100 demonstrations or twice out of 100 demonstrations. It happened over and over and over and over again. Acting like a polite stranger got these students in big trouble. Family members were first stupefied before becoming angry and upset, followed by withdrawal, denunciation, or retaliation. That there was righteous hostility on behalf of the offended. In 4/5 of the cases, family members were stupefied. They vigorously sought to make strange actions intelligible and to restore the situation to normal appearances. Reports were filled with accounts of astonishment, bewilderment, shock, anxiety, embarrassment, and anger, and with charges by various family members that the student was mean, inconsiderate, selfish, nasty, or impolite. Family members demanded explanations for this polite behavior. What's the matter? What's gotten into you? Did you get fired? Are you sick? What are you being so superior about? Why are you mad? Are you out of your mind, or are you just stupid? One student acutely embarrassed his mother in front of her friends by asking if she minded if he had a snack from the refrigerator. Mind if you have a little snack? You've been eating little snacks around here for years without asking me. What's gotten into you? They insisted that children provide accounts. So this was the order, just in the way that we talked about, right? Goffman. And Goffman's the condition, no, my mic's not on. Condition of co-presence, right? And once we find ourselves in a condition of co-presence, there's something of a protocol, a series of steps that are enacted. We go from co-presence to immediately engaging in arts and impression management, wanting to influence, control the conduct of others. There's a protocol that also unfolds here. Upon the breach of convention, or individuals acting not as intimates in the presence of their family, but acting as strangers. The first thing is the individuals get upset at when they're polite. And secondly, they start demanding accounts. What about the conversation clarification experiment? Here's another experiment worth reading. Students were instructed in this experiment to engage an acquaintance or friend in an ordinary conversation and insist the person clarify the sense of his commonplace remarks. Sanctioning, we find the same pattern. We see a sanctioning, righteous hostility, followed by demand of accounts. So here we go. Case 1. The subject was telling the experimenter, a member of the subject's carpool, about having had a flat tire while going to work the previous day. Subject: I had a flat tire. Experimenter: what do you mean you had a flat tire? She appeared momentarily stunned. Then she answered in a hostile way, what do you mean? What do you mean? A flat tire is a flat tire. That is what I meant. Nothing special. What a crazy question. Case 3. On Friday night, my husband and I were watching television. My husband remarked that he was tired. I asked, how are you tired? Physically, mentally, or just bored? Subject: I don't know. I guess physically mainly. Experimenter: do you mean that your muscles ache or your bones? Subject: I guess so. Don't be so technical. After more movie watching. Subject: all of these old movies have the same kind of old iron bedstead on them. Experimenter replies, what do you mean? Do you mean all old movies, or some of them, or just the ones you have seen? The subject replies, what's the matter with you? You know what I mean. The experimenter says, I wish you would be more specific. And the subject says, you know what I mean, drop dead. And lastly, case 6. The victim waved his hand cheerily. Subject: how are you? Experimenter: how am I in regard to what? My health, my finance, my schoolwork, my peace of mind, my ... Subject, who is red in the face and suddenly out of control, yells, look, I was just trying to be polite. Frankly, I don't give a damn how you are. All they were asking for was some clarification. And people got so hostile because when you say, hey, how are you? You're not really, it's just, it's a way of greeting somebody. You don't really expect them to get into any unnecessary details about how they are. It's just a greeting. And then when a person says, oh, boy, and unloads, then of course that person says, oh, that is not what I wanted. I did not really want to hear about all your problems. Why is this sociologically significant? Why are these responses to breaching experiments sociologically significant? The reaction of righteous hostility reveals the moral foundation of the social order. We trust that others will engage in the necessary accommodative work to help the speaker be intelligible and to help move the interaction along. People trust that others will comply with the background expectancies of everyday life, with what is commonly understood and commonly expected. This is what makes the social order a matter of common trust. Work with me here. Work with me. And when a person refuses to work with the speaker, then the speaker gets upset, is righteously offended. Because they're breaching convention, they're breaching the responsibilities of their role, of their obligations. There's a sense of obligation, as Durkheim would say. What is the essence of any moral order? A sense of obligation. And so, in a micro interactive environment, the obligation that we have towards one another is helping the event transpire with minimal friction. The term trust refers to a person's compliance with the expectancies of the attitude of daily life, maintaining the taken for granted. Maintaining the taken for granted. That it is true that we could interpret the same thing differently when somebody asks, how are you doing? And say, oh, I'm doing great. Sure, we could interpret that as an open-ended question that requires 30 minutes of the person's time. But in that particular context, that's not the rule of interaction. The rule of interaction is to simply treat that as a greeting and to go along as if it's a... And the person would say, well, I would have never asked you how you're doing if you were to complicate things so much by spending 30 minutes telling me about the problems in your life. But again, it's different. And it's context dependent. What if you're in a therapeutic setting? What if you're meeting with a counselor? What if you're meeting with your psychoanalyst? And they say, how are you doing? Well, then you don't just go, oh yeah, I'm fine. You'd sit there for an hour, I'm fine. No, in that case, that utterance, that question, was meant to spark an hour-long conversation. So it's the hearer that understands, is able to distinguish and differentiate the meaning of the exact same utterance, which is, how are you doing? Walking past somebody in the hallway in Haynes Hall, you say, oh, I'm doing good. See you around. Same question asked in therapy. You have an hour. Tell me about how things have been going for you. Maintaining the taken for granted is not merely a cognitive task, but one in which each actor trusts that the other will accomplish as a matter of moral necessity. Family members trust that relatives will act towards them as intimates and not strangers. Why are you, especially in the company, people get very sensitive, particularly when in the company of their friends or significant others. Why are you acting like a stranger when I'm in the company of my friends? Are you trying to embarrass me? Why are you acting so polite? What's the point of this? That mother or father was trusting that their child was going to act as an intimate, which they are, and don't need to ask permission to have a little snack. Speakers trust that listeners will draw upon what everybody knows to make reasonable sense of what they are saying. Compliance, in other words, is presumed. Presumed. That breaches of background expectancies lead to the sanctioning of action, that is to say, criticism or name-calling, shows that people hold others morally accountable for accommodative work. If they didn't feel it was an obligation of others to perform accommodative work, then they wouldn't be so righteously hostile when those individuals abdicated their responsibility to engage in accommodative work. It's the abdication of that, because we're operating on the assumption that it is part of what we would call deference or being respectful. That the respectful person engages in accommodative work. It's the disrespectful person that doesn't. In everyday life, action is always understood as the product of accountable moral choice. Why are you acting this way? And immediately when that person goes off script, they're not engaged in accommodative work, we hold them accountable. We say, we want an explanation. We want to know why you're acting like a stranger here at the house. We want to know why. In these experiments, deviance was presumed to be motivated. Deviance was presumed to be motivated deviance. That is to say, it was chosen. And because it's perceived as a chosen behavior, then an account is required. Tell me. Tell me why you're acting as you're acting. That's whenever you know that you're doing, that's a telltale sign of deviant behavior. Is the minute you engage in deviant behavior, people start asking questions like as to what your motivations are. If you go along with the conventions of everyday life, and you're engaged in what is considered to be normal conforming behavior, nobody asks any questions at all. Nobody asks you, why are you conforming? Why are you complying? Why are you doing what you're told? None of that is ever asked. The questions begin once the behavior is seen to be deviant. And then the person says, okay, you deviated, I need an explanation as to why you deviated. The line of questioning gives us insight into where the boundaries between conforming behavior and deviant behavior are. It's the deviant that has to then account for their deviance. It's not the conformist that has to account for the conforming behavior. Because the conforming behavior respects the facticity of social reality. And we're expected to go along with it, to treat it as real. It's the deviant, though, that breaches that. Putting social reality, possibly testing the integrity of it. This reveals an essential feature of the normative order, that people are responsible for providing accounts of their behavior. It is through the practice of accounting that social reality or order is achieved. Because we're telling people all day long. If I have an appointment with a student and it's, say, at 3 p.m. and the student shows up at 3:05 p.m., I don't even have to ask for an account. They're going to give me one. They're going to say, sorry, I'm late. The parking was terrible. I didn't even ask. Because they deviated. We're supposed to meet at 3. It's 3:05. They're late. What we do throughout the day is account to others about what we're doing. About what we're doing. And in the process, we're making intelligible what it is that we're doing. And we're also helping to maintain the social order. This is what is meant by accounting practices. And we engage in accounting practices all day long. Telling others what we're doing. We are making sense of our behaviors for others. But as Garfinkel had said, in order to get to the phenomenon, explain the phenomenon of social order, we have to investigate the sense-making practices that people are engaged in. Well, that's accounting practices. The methods and procedures employed by individuals to make action intelligible. I don't even have to ask, why are you late? They're just going to tell me why they're late. The documentary method interpretations we talked about at the beginning of class. Indexical expressions or indexicality, taking the context into account. How are you doing? Well, are we passing each other in a hallway or are we in a psychotherapeutic context? The context will decide how I'm going to respond to that. I mean, a very difficult patient would be the person that treats it as just a comment or a greeting, passing it to the person in the hallway. The therapist is going to be, wow, this is like pulling teeth. I need you to tell me more. You can't just say you're doing fine. And descriptive accountings. These are all practices that are used to achieve understanding. These are all practices that are used to achieve intelligibility, sense-making. But again, we have to do that. We know the times that are most chaotic in life is when we can't make heads or tails out of things, right? Where it's complicated to know what's going on. Eventually, Garfinkel will say, we will make sense of things. Garfinkel's argument is the following. The orderliness and the facticity of social reality is an achievement. We do it all day long. All all day long we're engaged in accommodative work. All day long we're engaged in accounting practices, telling others, even if we're not even asked, why we did what we did. All day long we're using indexicality, and we're taking context into account to help the speaker make sense. Created and sustained by the artful methods individuals employ to make their motives and actions intelligible. So there is a shared obligation, in other words. Garfinkel found demonstration after demonstration after demonstration. People get angry when other people do not fulfill their obligations. So what's the obligation? The obligation, all of us know, is to maintain the facts of social life. That's the obligation, to engage in accommodative work. And if you're not doing it, then you're going to upset people because they expect you to do it. The possibility of common understanding consists entirely in the enforceable character of actions in compliance with the expectancies of everyday life as a morality. To comply. And when one engages in non-compliance, boom, you have a sanction. You have a criticism. Right? You have to do something that identifies that action as deviant in order to punish the person, bring them back into line with their obligations and the morality of everyday life. People's compliance with the practice of accounting is what renders action intelligible. That it becomes more or less automatic. What follows the instances of non-compliance? Well, we saw with the border experiment. When students fail to provide accounts, family members supply their own. This is what I find so fascinating. What Garvey was able to identify is the first step is making sense of some disorder. The second step is determining whether or not the sense that was made is actually correct. I love this. This is really my favorite. Like, truth can wait. We have to first make sense. We have to reach some consensus as to what's going on here. And it may be that decades or centuries later, we have to actually come to the conclusion that the sense we made was actually, in fact, wrong. Sense making comes first. Then we get to the problem of, is it true or is it false? The sense that we just made. So it was the family members who said, okay, we want to know what's going on. Why are you acting this way? Why are you acting like a stranger? A polite stranger, but like a stranger. It may be that student doesn't provide an adequate answer. What happens? The family members supply their own. These were all wrong, but it's an attempt by family members to make sense of what's going on. It's not about whether it's right or wrong at this point. The truth can wait. It's just trying to establish some working theory, working hypothesis about what's going on. The student was working too hard in school. The student was ill. There had been another fight with a fiancé. Were any of these things actually true? No, those things were not true. In fact, what was going on is that these individuals were engaged in a breaching experiment. So Garfinkel is telling us that this is really, what is the matter of moral necessity? It's making sense of what's going on. And then later we can find out, we can ask the question, if the sense that we made is actually true and correct. The truth can wait. As it has for millennia. The truth can wait. What's critical is just to establish some consensus as to what's going on. And maybe, just maybe, thousands of years from now, we can get to whether the sense that we make of things is actually true. But again, we can apply the documentary method of interpretation to the breaching experiment. There was a search for and perception of a pattern, presumed evidence of environmental stress. They kept coming back to that. Okay. All right, so that's it. Thursday, on to Foucault.